For decades, the biggest fear in global markets was this: what happens if China stops selling rare earth minerals? But that question may already be too small, because China's real power is not just rare earths, it is something much bigger. China has spent the last 30 years building control over the industrial supply chains that keep the modern economy running: the batteries powering electric vehicles, the chemicals used in manufacturing, the components inside electronics, the machinery that produces everything from solar panels to advanced tech. The world thought China was becoming the factory of the world, but what many missed is that the factory itself became a source of geopolitical power. And now, as tensions between China and the West increase, Beijing has something that few countries have ever possessed: the ability to create pressure by controlling the inputs the global economy depends on. Today we examine China's hidden weapon, its industrial chokepoint power. The world's first experienced China's supply chain leverage through critical minerals. Rare earth elements sound obscure, but they are essential. They're used in electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, smartphones, defense systems, advanced tech. China dominates the processing of many of these materials, and that distinction matters. The world often focuses on where minerals are mined, but the real strategic advantage is often in refining and processing. A country can have resources underground and still depend on China to turn those resources into usable industrial materials. That is where Beijing has built influence. In recent years, China has moved away from simply being the largest supplier to actively managing access. Rather than imposing outright bans, Beijing has increasingly used export licensing. This creates something more powerful than complete shutdown: uncertainty. Companies and countries do not know whether supply will arrive next month. They can't easily calculate the risk, and they begin changing behavior before restrictions are even introduced. That is the strategic value of a choke point. The threat does not need to be used fully. The possibility alone creates leverage. Now, China's bigger advantage is the industrial ecosystem, because just focusing on rare earths misses the bigger picture. Its greatest advantage is not just one resource, it's the entire industrial ecosystem. Over decades, China built dominance across thousands of intermediate goods. They are not consumer products. They are the components and materials that allow other countries to produce and manufacture. Think about the global economy as a giant machine. China increasingly supplies many of the parts inside that machine: industrial chemicals, specialized materials, machinery components, battery technology, electronic inputs, clean energy equipment. These are the building blocks of modern production, and this creates a different type of power. If China restricts a consumer product, the political backlash is immediate. People notice. But if China restricts a specialized industrial component, the impact is often invisible at first. A factory somewhere in Europe or America simply cannot produce. A supply chain slows down, costs rise, investment decisions change. The pressure appears before the public even understands what happened. This is why intermediate goods are strategically important. They sit at the foundation of the global economy. Now let's see why China's strategy is different. A common misunderstanding is that China wants to destroy global trade. That is not the objective. China benefits enormously from global trade. Its strategy is more calculated. Beijing wants leverage. The goal is to influence decisions by creating enough uncertainty that foreign governments and companies think twice before challenging Chinese interests. Beijing's approach is usually controlled, targeted, and reversible. Instead of a complete embargo, it prefers tools such as licensing restrictions, regulatory pressure, limits on specific companies, controls on specific technologies. But why? Because broad disruption would hurt China too. China is deeply integrated into the global economy. The most effective weapon is not destroying the system, it's controlling critical parts of it. Now let's explore the new China retaliation toolkit. China has been developing and expanding the legal framework behind these actions. It's developed new rules allowing it to respond against companies complying with foreign restrictions, and governments introducing what China considers discriminatory measures, firms involved in supply chain restrictions. The message is clear. If foreign governments or entities try to limit China's economic power, China will respond. This creates a new reality for them. A business operating globally is no longer thinking about costs and efficiency and reliability. It now must also think of geopolitical exposure. Where are inputs coming from? Who controls the supply chain? What happens if governments impose restrictions? The era of purely economic decision-making is fading quickly. Supply chains have become strategic assets. Now let's move to the US-China competition, which is moving into a new phase. The biggest consequence is that the relationship between China and the West is changing. The old model was China manufactures, the world buys, everyone benefits. But the new model is countries are asking now, what happens if China uses economic dependence as leverage? This is why governments are moving towards domestic industrial investment, friendshoring, supply chain diversification, alliances with strategic partners. But there is a challenge. Reducing dependence on China is much easier said than done. China's manufacturing ecosystem took decades to build. Replacing it will take years, if not decades. And in many areas, China remains the most competitive supplier. The question is no longer, can the world completely separate from China? Because that answer is probably no. The real question is, how much dependence is acceptable? The next decade of geopolitical competition will not only be fought over military power, it will be fought over something more fundamental. Who controls the systems that make the modern economy function? Rare earths were the first real warning. But the bigger story is industrial supply chains. China's advantage comes from controlling the inputs behind everything else: materials, components, technology, manufacturing capacity. The world spent decades benefiting from China's industrial rise. Now governments are discovering that the same industrial dominance that created efficiency can also create vulnerability. The future battle is not only over who makes the final product, it is who controls the foundations underneath it. And in that context, China still holds some of the strongest cards.